It began the way these stories always do, not with a loud explosion of conflict, but with small, carefully sharpened daggers of hostility hidden behind polite smiles, nods, and letters signed with concern. The neighborhood was one of those manicured suburbs where the sidewalks were spotless, the lawns looked copied from magazines, and the homeowners association clung to power like a small kingdom. It was the kind of place where one wrong shade of paint or a mailbox slightly tilted could spark weeks of whispered gossip. And for years, the black families who moved in were made to feel like tolerated outsiders, never equals. When Marcus Johnson, a respected attorney with a calm presence and a loyal golden retriever named Duke, moved into the community with his wife and daughter, the tension simmered quietly at first. People smiled at him, but their eyes betrayed something colder, something unspoken. The HOA president, Meredith Clark, a woman whose life revolved around controlling every inch of the neighborhood, had built a reputation for being merciless to those she disapproved of. And when she first saw Marcus walking his dog, her lips curled in disdain. She began with muttered comments about keeping large animals on a leash, though Duke was gentle and never off-leash. Then came the official warnings. Letters accusing Marcus of letting his dog bark too late at night. Complaints about muddy paw prints near the sidewalk. Fabricated charges of aggression whenever Duke so much as looked at another neighbor's pet. At meetings, Meredith's voice dripped with venom as she insisted she was only upholding community standards. But her eyes always lingered on Marcus in a way that told the truth. It wasn't about the dog, it was about the man holding the leash. Soon, the harassment escalated. Anonymous notes appeared on Marcus's porch telling him to take his mutt and his family back where they came from. His trash cans were mysteriously overturned in the night, and his daughter whispered that other kids at school said their parents didn't want his kind living in their perfect little neighborhood. Yet Marcus tried to brush it off, believing reason would prevail. Until the night his security cameras caught Meredith herself, standing at the edge of his yard at midnight, snapping pictures of Duke, scribbling in a notebook, as if building a case against them. The air in the community grew poisonous. He was fined for his lawn, for a fence measurement that passed inspection for everyone else, for leaving a child's bicycle by the garage for one single afternoon. It became clear. Meredith wasn't trying to control his dog, she was trying to erase him. The climax of her obsession came when animal control showed up at his door, unannounced, demanding to inspect Duke after reports that the dog was dangerous. The officer seemed uneasy when he saw Duke wagging his tail, calm and gentle, but he admitted that multiple complaints had been filed, all traced back to the HOA president. Marcus's wife broke down in tears that night, terrified their beloved dog would be taken away. And still, Meredith didn't stop. She rallied her allies at HOA meetings, pushing for a new rule banning certain breeds and large dogs, wording carefully disguised to target Marcus alone. She stood before the board with fire in her eyes, painting Duke as a menace, Marcus as reckless, their family as disruptive to community peace. Every sentence was laced with that venomous undertone of racism, cloaked just enough to sound respectable but clear to anyone listening closely. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some daring to defend Marcus. But Meredith wielded power like a weapon, intimidating anyone who opposed her. Marcus knew then that this wasn't about bylaws, or dogs, or community standards. It was about something deeper, uglier, the kind of hatred that hides in rules, fines, and official letters. And as he sat in his study late one night, surrounded by piles of HOA notices and his own legal notes, he realized this would not end with words. Meredith was escalating, and if he didn't act, she would not stop until his dog was gone, his family broken, and his place in that neighborhood erased. What she didn't know was that Marcus was no ordinary homeowner, and when he finally struck back, he would use the very system she worshipped: the rules, the laws, the board she controlled against her. The battle for Duke was only beginning, but beneath it lay something far larger: the battle for dignity, justice, and the right to exist in a place that wanted him gone. Marcus Johnson had worked his entire life for the kind of peace most people only dream about: the kind that came with tree-lined streets, quiet evenings, and the comfort of a home his family could truly call their own. After years of defending clients in courtrooms stained with injustice, he wanted nothing more than to raise his daughter in a neighborhood where she could ride her bike without fear and where his wife, Carla, could finally feel safe after the long nights waiting for him to return from trials. Their move into Fairview Estates, a gated suburban community with neatly trimmed hedges and rows of identical mailboxes, felt like the reward for years of sacrifice. Yet from the first day, Marcus sensed something off. The welcome was polite, but distant neighbors offering thin smiles that faded as soon as they turned their backs. His golden retriever, Duke, became an instant companion on evening walks, his calm presence breaking the silence of streets that seemed too perfect, too controlled. But where Marcus saw a loyal family dog, others seemed to see a threat. At first, it was small comments, someone muttering that big dogs don't belong here. Another neighbor clutching their own pet a little tighter as he passed. The homeowners association, led by Meredith Clark, enforced its rules with an iron grip, and Marcus quickly noticed how those rules were never applied evenly. Families who looked like Meredith skated by with unapproved patio furniture, peeling shutters, or barking terriers that snarled at passersby. But when Marcus's trash bin was left out for an extra hour, he received a written warning. He laughed it off at first, thinking it was a simple oversight, until the warnings piled up: fines for leaving Duke's water bowl on the porch, citations for a lawn that was trimmed but not uniform, notes taped to his door about Duke being too intimidating for the neighborhood. These weren't rules, Marcus realized, they were weapons. Behind every envelope bearing the HOA seal was the same unspoken message: he and his family didn't belong. Carla urged him to ignore it, to focus on the life they were building. But even she couldn't hide her unease when Duke's gentle bark at the mailman led to a complaint filed with animal control. Their daughter overheard kids whispering at school, repeating the words their parents spoke at home, saying that people like them were ruining the neighborhood. Marcus tried to push it down, tried to tell himself that reason and civility could break through, that as long as he kept his head high, the storm would pass. But Fairview Estates wasn't built on fairness, it was built on control, and Meredith Clark thrived on it. Her reputation stretched far beyond the cul-de-sac. A woman who sat at the center of every HOA meeting like a queen on a throne, her binder of bylaws in front of her and her allies nodding on command. She relished the power to dictate, to approve, to punish, and the arrival of Marcus gave her a new target, one that stoked the very prejudices she hid behind rules and standards. When Marcus spoke at meetings, her smile was tight, her gaze sharp, and every suggestion he made was struck down with exaggerated concern. Duke became the perfect excuse, the vessel for her obsession. She whispered that the dog barked too loud, that he frightened children, that his size violated some obscure regulation, and while most neighbors knew Duke was harmless, few dared to contradict her. Marcus began to see the pattern, the subtle ways Meredith controlled the room, the fear she inspired, the calculated pauses when she mentioned protecting the community's character. It wasn't about a dog, and it wasn't about rules, it was about him. Every walk with Duke turned into a test of endurance, every glance from across the street a reminder that someone was always watching. The air in Fairview Estates carried an invisible weight, heavy with suspicion and resentment. And though Marcus longed for peace, he could feel the walls closing in. He had chosen this place for safety, for stability, but the deeper he sank into its perfect lawns and pristine facades, the clearer it became that the real danger wasn't outside the gates, it was living right next door. Marcus had hoped that the storm would settle, that if he remained polite, followed the rules, and kept his head down, the hostility might fade. But instead, it sharpened, taking on a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like a campaign. Each week brought new notices from the HOA, printed in bold red letters as if his minor infractions were threats to the entire neighborhood's safety. Yet when he looked around, the hypocrisy was plain. Children from Meredith's circle left bikes scattered across the sidewalks, Lawns bristled with weeds, and smaller dogs barked well past midnight without so much as a reprimand. His own family, however, lived under a magnifying glass, and Duke became the symbol Meredith used to stoke the fire. It began with whispers at HOA meetings, carefully crafted comments about community, safety, and standards. But soon, Marcus discovered anonymous notes slipped under his door, words dripping with venom. Dangerous animals don't belong here. Keep that mutt inside or pay the price, and the most chilling of all, this neighborhood wasn't built for people like you. He tried to ignore them, but the notes kept coming, each one written with a sharper edge. Carla urged him to report it, yet Marcus knew too well how subtle racism cloaked itself in deniability. He complained. Meredith would dismiss it as paranoia, another sign that he couldn't follow rules. But ignoring it did nothing to stop the escalation. One evening, as he returned from work, he noticed Meredith standing at the edge of his property with a clipboard, snapping photos of Duke as he played in the yard, her face twisted with satisfaction, as if she had caught him in some crime. The following day, Marcus was cited for allowing an aggressive breed to roam freely. Even though Duke was a retriever known for his gentleness, the label was a fabrication, a lie cloaked in official language, but it carried weight. Soon, animal control arrived, knocking on Marcus's door with reports of a dangerous dog terrorizing neighbors. Marcus invited them in, showing them Duke's calm nature, his vaccination records, his obedience training, and though the officers left without action, the humiliation lingered, the unspoken knowledge that someone had weaponized the system against him. What gnawed at Marcus wasn't just the lies, but the complicity. The way neighbors who knew Duke was harmless remained silent, their eyes averted as if speaking out would paint targets on their own backs. Meredith controlled the narrative, and Marcus felt the walls of Fairview Estates pressing tighter, his every move monitored, his every mistake amplified. Fines stacked higher, now for trivialities like unsightly lawn chairs or leaving his curtains partially open. And while Marcus could afford to pay them, it was the principle that burned. His daughter came home from school in tears, telling him other children had said her dad's dog was going to be put down because their mums heard it at the meeting. The cruelty seeped into his home, poisoning the very peace he had worked for, and still, Meredith pushed harder. One night, his security cameras caught her again, pacing outside his property near midnight, scribbling into her notebook as she glared at Duke, sleeping peacefully on the porch. Another time, Marcus returned to find his fence vandalized with crude graffiti. A word scrawled in jagged letters that reminded him exactly how deep the hatred ran. He knew Meredith hadn't held the spray can herself, but she had given permission with her relentless whispers, her calculated fear-mongering that cast him as the outsider, the threat. Marcus wrestled with anger and restraint, knowing that one outburst, one misstep, would be twisted into proof of everything they accused him of. Yet beneath the weight of humiliation, another fire began to burn, a determination that he would not let Meredith rewrite the truth, that he would not let Duke become a pawn in her crusade. He began gathering every letter, photographing every violation, documenting every instance of unequal enforcement, building a record as meticulous as Meredith's own notes. He sat quietly in meetings, watching her sway the room, listening as she spoke of maintaining the character of the neighborhood, her words laced with coded venom, and though the neighbors nodded, Marcus began to notice cracks, hesitations in their eyes, discomfort in their silence. The injustice was becoming too obvious to ignore, too glaring to be explained away as rules fairly applied. He realized then that Meredith wasn't just trying to take Duke, she was testing the limits of her power, measuring how far she could go in, erasing his presence altogether. And Marcus, a man who had fought in courts against systemic prejudice, understood that the fight was no longer just about fines or bylaws, it was about survival, dignity, and the right to exist without apology in a place he had earned. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering August evening when Marcus returned home to find a final notice taped in bold letters across his front door, declaring that Duke must be removed from the property within 7 days or the HOA would take necessary action. a threat that dripped with menace and carried the weight of Meredith's signature at the bottom, like a final stamp of authority. His hands trembled as he tore the paper down, not from fear, but from the suffocating rage of being pushed too far. And when he walked into the emergency HOA meeting that night, the room was already humming with whispers, eyes darting toward him, and then away, as if his very presence had tainted the air. Meredith stood at the front with her usual air of smug superiority, her notebook clasped like a weapon, declaring that the neighborhood was at risk, that children were terrified, and that standards must be upheld. Marcus listened, his jaw clenched, until she unveiled a stack of fabricated complaints, each one more outrageous than the last. Painting Duke as a savage beast, Marcus as a negligent owner, and his family as a threat to Fairview Estates' image. The silence in the room was thick, a silence carved out of complicity and fear, and Marcus could feel the noose tightening until he stood, calm but unshakable, and placed his own stack of evidence on the table. One by one, he unveiled the photographs, the recordings, the letters, the fines selectively applied only to him, the midnight footage of Meredith herself, prowling his property with that damning notebook. Gasps cut through the crowd as the truth bled into the open, the mask of rules and standards stripped away to reveal pure malice and racism driving her every action. Meredith sputtered, denying, accusing. But the neighbors' eyes had changed. Where there had once been nods of agreement, now there was unease, shame, and even disgust at the woman who had crowned herself queen of their community. For the first time, Marcus felt the tide shift, felt Meredith's power splinter under the weight of her own obsession, and in that moment, the dog she had tried so desperately to ban became the living, breathing symbol of her defeat. The days that followed the explosive HOA meeting unfolded like the slow cracking of a facade that had stood too long under pressure. And for once, Marcus was not the one under the microscope. Word spread quickly through Fairview Estates. Neighbors, whispering about Meredith's midnight prowling, about the doctored complaints, about the way she had twisted rules into weapons designed not to protect the community but to target and humiliate a black man who had never once broken the spirit of the neighborhood. The evidence Marcus laid bare could not be swept under the rug, and though Meredith tried to maintain her composure, calling it all a misunderstanding, her allies grew quiet, their silence betraying the truth they had long ignored. Within weeks, the HOA board convened an emergency session, not to punish Marcus but to strip Meredith of her position, her once commanding voice reduced to frantic pleas that no longer carried weight. Watching her walk out of that meeting, head lowered, notebook clutched uselessly against her chest, Marcus felt no triumph, only a deep weary relief, because he understood that what had been taken from him was more than fines and notices, had been his peace, his dignity, his sense of belonging in a neighborhood where he had invested not just money but dreams of safety for his family. Duke remained by his side through it all, a gentle reminder that the battle was never really about a dog but about the color of his skin, the assumptions painted on him by those unwilling to see him as anything but an outsider. Yet out of that fire, Marcus found something unexpected, a shift in the community itself. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes began to nod at him on the street, some even offering apologies, awkward and halting but sincere. Carla noticed. It toothed away, invitations trickled in. The way children who had once avoided Duke now reached out to pet him. The way silence gave way, however cautiously, to solidarity. Marcus knew racism did not vanish with Meredith's fall. That another version of her might rise somewhere else. Another HOA Karen with another notebook and another excuse to police black existence. But he also knew that standing tall, gathering the truth, refusing to bend under the weight of lies, had cracked something open. Not just for him, but for those who had witnessed it. His victory was not in Meredith's disgrace, but in reclaiming the narrative she had tried to write over him. Proving that dignity cannot be stripped away by whispers, fines, or even orchestrated hate. On a quiet evening weeks later, Marcus sat on his porch, Duke resting his head at his feet, and watched the sun dip behind the neat rows of houses. The peace felt different now, not naive but hard-won, tempered by the knowledge of what had been endured and survived. He thought of the neighbors who had stayed silent too long, of the board that had allowed Meredith to reign unchecked. And he wondered if the true lesson would linger, or if time would dull its edge. Perhaps the most unsettling truth of all was that Meredith had not been unique. She had simply been the loudest, boldest embodiment of something that still thrummed beneath the surface of countless communities across the country. But as Marcus stroked Duke's fur and listened to the cicadas hum in the trees, he understood the power of resilience, of refusing to be erased. And he found himself asking a question that reached beyond the neat lawns of Fairview Estates. How many others would have to endure a Meredith before the system itself learned to see the truth? And in that question lay the real weight of his story, not in the downfall of one woman, but in the reminder that racism, no matter how carefully disguised behind bylaws and standards, could always be dragged into the light by those with the courage to stand firm. Marcus Johnson had moved into Fairview Estates with hope stitched into every step, believing the quiet streets, manicured lawns, and family-friendly atmosphere would finally give him the peace he'd worked years to afford. But beneath the white picket fences and HOA newsletters, resentment simmered like an unspoken curse. And Marcus, a successful black man with a loyal dog named Duke, quickly learned that peace was something not everyone was willing to grant him. The HOA president, Meredith Whitfield, was the kind of neighbor who saw herself as the guardian of perfection, her eyes scanning for violations like a hawk searching for prey. But when it came to Marcus, her obsession took on a venom that could not be explained by bylaws or landscaping standards alone. Duke, a calm and affectionate German shepherd, became the focus of her campaign, labeled as dangerous, intimidating, and a risk to the community. And soon anonymous complaints began stacking up, alleging barking at odd hours, chasing children, and threatening joggers, none of which had ever happened. Marcus realized quickly these weren't misunderstandings. They were weapons, carefully crafted to remind him that no matter how hard he worked or how much he achieved, in Meredith's eyes he was an outsider who didn't belong. The first notices were frustrating, the fines insulting, but as Meredith escalated, patrolling his property with a notebook in hand, photographing Duke from behind bushes, and whispering to neighbors about safety concerns, the weight of her campaign began to choke the air. Marcus breathed, until every walk with Duke felt like walking through a minefield. Neighbors, once polite if distant, started looking away when he passed, some whispering under their breath, others crossing the street entirely, and though Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity, the sting of being treated like a threat in the very neighborhood he helped support dug into him like shards of glass. His wife Carla urged patience, reminding him of their children's safety. But Marcus felt the tension building, each notice, each whisper, each cold glance adding fuel to a fire that was threatening to consume the fragile peace of Fairview. When the HOA called an emergency meeting, supposedly to address ongoing community safety concerns, Marcus knew it was not a meeting at all, but a trial, staged to corner him into submission. The room was packed, neighbors crammed into folding chairs, their faces lit with curiosity and unease, while Meredith stood at the front with her arms folded, her voice dripping with righteous authority as she unveiled stacks of papers filled with false complaints, painted Duke as a menace, and painted Marcus as negligent, defiant, and dangerous. The silence in that room was suffocating, not because the neighbors believed her, but because silence was safer than speaking out against the woman who had ruled them with fear for years. But Marcus had come prepared. He laid down his own stack of evident security footage showing Duke lying calmly in the yard, while Meredith prowled outside at 2 a.m. scribbling notes, recordings of neighbors admitting Meredith pressured them into filing complaints, photographs of fines issued only to his property for violations ignored elsewhere. Gasps rippled through the room as truth peeled away Meredith's mask, revealing not a vigilant leader, but a racist crusader who had weaponized the HOA to wage a personal war. Her voice cracked as she tried to deny it, tried to reframe it as duty, but the evidence was undeniable, and eyes that once looked away from Marcus now turned toward Meredith with disgust. In that moment, her power collapsed, not in a fiery explosion but in the quiet crumbling of credibility, and Marcus stood, taller, not because he had won a petty battle over a dog, but because he had refused to bow beneath the weight of lies and hatred. Within weeks, Meredith was voted out of the HOA presidency. Her influence dissolved into whispers of shame. While Marcus, once treated as a pariah, was approached by neighbors who now offered apologies, hesitant smiles, and even requests for him to run for the board himself, though he declined, preferring to keep his family's peace rather than police others. Marcus knew that something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth. Duke remained the same loyal companion he had always been, his steady presence a living reminder that the battle had never truly been about a dog, but about the skin of the man holding the leash, about how racism could cloak itself in rules and standards until someone was brave enough to expose it. On a warm evening, months later, Marcus sat on his porch as Duke rested his head at his feet, watching children who once avoided the dog now laughing as they ran past, watching neighbors who once crossed the street now wave in passing, and he felt a peace that was different from the day he moved in. No longer the naive peace of believing a perfect neighborhood could exist, but the earned peace of knowing he had survived the ugliness hiding behind manicured lawns and HOA rulebooks. Yet beneath that peace lay a question that haunted him, one he carried like a quiet weight. How many more would have to endure a Meredith? How many more would be forced to prove their worth in communities that claimed fairness while practicing exclusion? The answer was not clear, but the story of Marcus and Duke stood as a reminder that racism, no matter how well disguised, cannot survive forever in the shadows, and that courage, when wielded with